Welcome to Successful Leadership in Times of Crisis, Supporting Remote Teams. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Yusra Benjeloun, Administrative Coordinator and Project Manager with the Work Wellness Institute, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. This webinar is made possible through the support of the Community Gaming Grant Program through the BC Government, as well as donations and memberships to WWI. We thank our program partners, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Education Advisory Committee, and speakers who contribute to this webinar series. While we're waiting for others to join us, I'll go over a few technical points for the webinar. You should be able to hear the presentation through your computer speakers or through the conference call line if you dialed in. Please use the question box to submit any issues you may be experiencing and to ask any questions you have related to the presentation. We will collect questions submitted throughout the presentation and follow it with a Q&A based on the questions submitted. Any questions not answered in the allotted time will be answered and distributed after the event. The presentation will be recorded and posted for free on our website along with the slides. You will be emailed the direct links for all of these items when they're available. The Work Wellness Institute is recognized by Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, to offer professional development credits. This webinar is valid for 1 PDC for the SHRM-CP or SHRM-SCP. This webinar is also valid for 1 hour credit for VRA Canada. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Laura Hambley and April Dyrda to this timely webinar. Dr. Laura Hambley is an industrial organizational psychologist based in Calgary, Alberta. Laura is co-founder and president of EvOHlution, which creates innovative assessments and training for mobile or remote employees, leaders, and teams. Laura is an experienced consultant and entrepreneur who is passionate about addressing the critical role of leadership, work styles and personality, and team dynamics as they relate to distributed work. Since 2004, Laura has published extensive research on the critical success factors for effectively leading distributed teams and has developed and delivered seminars on distributed teams for organizations, universities, and international conferences. In addition to Work EvOHlution, Laura co-founded Canada Career Counseling in Toronto, Calgary, the Leadership Success Group, and leads a team of workplace psychologists across Canada. Work EvOHlution's distributed work profiler was written about in Scientific American magazine as the world's first personality profile of a remote worker. Work EvOHlution was also selected to present 3 times at South by Southwest, the Innovation Mega Conference in Austin, Texas, 2018 and 2019. April is a registered provisional psychologist and workplace psychology consultant with nearly a decade of experience researching and supporting career transitions. Her educational and professional background is centered on the investigation of how individuals can best approach and navigate change in their work and workplaces. Involved with Work EvOHlution since its inception in 2014, April brings a specialized research background to her consultant experience that provides her with the unique ability to translate research into practical results and actionable solutions for organizations. April is an experienced and sought-after speaker, having delivered numerous sessions at conferences and to organizations across Canada. Dr. Hambley and Ms. April Dyrda, thank you so much for being with us today. Immediately, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. That was quite the intro, Yusra. It is very great to be here with you all today. I'm in Calgary and there's a blizzard outside. It pretty much looks like a winter wonderland today. And today is a day where a lot of people in our city are lucky not to be commuting. And I think the commute in a lot of ways takes a lot of our valuable time. So I'm a huge advocate for remote work. And I have been for 16 years. So I don't need to belabor this because Yusra already talked about this in our intro, April and myself. And what we do is we help improve organizational performance when it comes to remote workplaces. We focus on leaders, individual contributors, and teams. So we've developed an innovative suite of psychometric assessments and the supporting, training, coaching, and consulting that goes with it to help make leaders successful remote managers, make teams highly effective and really great at communication and collaboration from a distance, and help individual contributors adapt successfully to working remotely. So now that the world has turned in this direction and towards this topic of remote work widely, we're really happy to be doing webinars to help share what we've learned over the last 16 years with you today. What we're sharing is high level. We're going to try and leave you with some practical habits and strategies though, but just know that we have training and coaching that goes much deeper. So even each of these topics alone can be 2 or 4 hours of training for an organization. So you're going to notice we're covering a lot of ground today on purpose because we wanted to really get you familiar with some of the key topics you should be aware of. So during the session, we always say, be here now to get the most of it, out of it, and make use of the Q&A and chat option. Your name won't be given to the group, so there's confidentiality maintained, and our wonderful moderator, Yusra, will make sure to look at your questions, and we'll be sure to answer them in the last 15 minutes. And the webinar will be recorded and shared with all, as will be the slide deck as a PDF, so you don't have to take notes vigorously. So we're going to talk about the challenges and opportunities of remote or distributed work. So we use those terms interchangeably throughout the presentation. We're going to talk about different assessment tools just to give you a sense of some of the things to be looking at when you think of how well people are functioning remotely. We're going to talk about practical habits that you can implement immediately as you lead remote teams. We're going to cover 3 territories: work-life wellness in remote work, establishing trust from a distance, and communication when you're apart. Again, each of these topics could be hours in itself. There's so much great information, but we want to leave you with some important nuggets, and then we'll have a conclusion and Q&A. So like I said, when we use the term distributed work, what we mean is when you're apart from your colleagues and apart from your supervisor at least some of the time. And this topic has been going on in a lot of ways. There's dispersed teams that are working out of different office buildings globally, for example. There's been teleworker programs here and there. There's been organizations who are doing activity-based work and creating flexible or agile workplaces where people can work where and when they're most effective and move between different settings, including home. But what COVID and this horrible crisis we're all going through has led to much more of a discussion on is these 3 areas. There's a lot of people working from home right now, which we call telework or telecommuting. And there's a lot of dispersed or virtual teams because of that. And a lot of people are working remotely or in a mobile way, mostly from home. And telework is something that works well when you can have preparation. You have a distraction-free home environment. You don't have your kids at home that you're trying to school at the same time. So we need to be really careful with the fact that this situation we're in now is far from ideal. And it's not a true test of telework effectiveness. But we're all in it together, and we need to do our very best to be productive and, most importantly, healthy mentally and physically through this disastrous period. And that's why we really focus on wellness and balance. I mean, I love the term balance as a mother of 3 kids myself and an entrepreneur, and nothing's ever perfectly in balance, to be honest with you. However, it's important that I feel well about my work, that I feel focused and productive, that I'm performing, and that I am managing my work and my life, and that I stay healthy during this pandemic, and I do my part in not spreading the virus. So really, balance is important, and wellness, and really managing my distractions and working productively when I am working from home, and providing strong remote leadership to my own team and helping other teams develop remote leadership, which we know there's a lot of behaviors and practices that work, and we know what doesn't work. So the good news is, when we look at the opportunities in all of this difficult time, the research over many years has shown us that productivity increases 10 to 30% for those working away from the traditional office. But this image on this slide is misleading because working away from the office remotely does not mean that you're doing childcare and homeschooling at the same time. I mean, that's not going to increase our productivity at all. It's not an ideal balance. But in general, those of us that can focus and that have the right setup and the right balance of time between an office and time at home are 10 to 30% more effective. But there's challenges involved, especially now if we have a spouse or partner working at home at the same time, if we have kids, and if we're just not set up properly, we don't have a distraction-free environment, we can have spillover and crossover effects. And that's when effects of work are felt at home. So we're bringing our work stress into our home environment and vice versa. Our family stress, like yesterday when my daughter came by my office, interrupted a really important meeting I had, that her budgie bird had escaped. And this budgie bird has been a pain in the butt anyway. But to have that type of interruption, I'm trying to balance everything with a budgie bird flying around the house. It's an example, right? It caused me stress, it caused her stress. And there's this incredible competition for energy as we compete between priorities in our work life, our personal life. There's just so much going on that way. And we're all susceptible to burnout, which will make us, our immune systems, not as good at fighting disease and virus. So we need to be very careful that we keep our health front of mind, because we are not computers. We are rechargeable beings that need time to recharge and focus on our own mental health and physical health on a daily basis right now. So we're going to start with a polling question just to get a sense of all of you 59 people who are attending, which is great to see. We want to get a sense of what you struggle most with when you're working remotely and leading remotely in particular, okay? So assuming, a lot of you are in some sort of supervisor or managerial role, you struggle most with establishing clear boundaries between your work and life, with maintaining communication with your team from a distance, with ensuring productivity is staying strong on your team, or with setting your own structure and organizing your team's structure. So the organizing aspect of this, or other. So April and I thought we would have another, and if you want to just enter some of the others into the chat, we might come up with some other things you're struggling with, which will help us out as well as we train you today.
So I'm not sure if you're seeing the results, Dr. Hambley, but 38% of our audience think establishing clear boundaries between work and life is the one that they struggle with the most. And then 3% responded maintaining communication with my team. 34% ensuring productivity stays strong in my team. 17% say setting my own structure and organizing my team. And 7% responded other. Some of the other comments were maintaining motivation to focus on work tasks.
Okay, maintaining motivation. Any others in that chat?
I'll just mention one more comment. So maintaining morale and a sense of connection between the team members.
Okay, great. Connection and morale, super important. Okay, yeah, so no, this is really interesting. The boundaries, 38% of you. And our last webinar was on blurred boundaries between work and life, because it's such an important topic for us. And there's so many strategies to work around that. And we'll be addressing a few of those today with you. So that's good. Communication we'll be touching on in part of April's section. And then productivity, we won't be getting into too much around that, but we'll try to make some tie-ins for you. And the staying motivated and stuff like that, we'll try to make tie-ins. And then the morale and sense of connection. I mean, let me tell you, there are such great technologies these days to feel connected. And last week we had a surprise 40th birthday party for our office manager in Toronto. And she was supposed to be in Australia. She's an Aussie. And she couldn't go for her 40th because of COVID. So what we did is we had a cake delivered, we had gifts, Australian themed gifts delivered, and she was to hop on a call with her boss. And she hopped onto the the web session. It was Zoom, and all of a sudden there were 12 or 15 of her colleagues on there to surprise her. And let me tell you, that was connection. That was great morale boosting. That was a pure sense of team connection, and it was all from a distance. So I'm just sharing that example from my team to show you that you can do creative things. You can celebrate birthdays, you can celebrate milestones, and stay connected with the video and with the web platforms. So I am just going to press here to move my slide to the next one. So leading in a mobile world, basically to sum it up, compared to leading face-to-face, when I have the luxury of walking down the hall and seeing my colleagues, you need all the skills that you need to lead face-to-face, but you need additional skills when you're leading remotely. That's what this slide is all about. You need a combination from all of our research of skills and attributes. Skills are the things that you are good at and you learn. Attributes are certain personality traits that do lead to behaviors, and it's the behaviors that you demonstrate as well as your skills that produce capabilities to manage remotely. And our capabilities model here has been honed over the years, and it is a great way of capturing all the different categories of capability that a leader needs remotely. So being accessible and supportive, building trusting relationships, creating a team of team unity, fostering collaboration from a distance. I mean, those are examples. And when you look at all of these 13 elements, and I ask you how many of these apply to a face-to-face environment, I know what your answer would be. It would be all of them apply, Laura, and you're absolutely right. All of these apply because you first and foremost need to be a good leader. And secondly, you need to add a lot more planfulness, intentionality, use of technology, and the nuances involved in communicating and leading from a distance to all of these different elements. And that's what we've dedicated our work evolution to. So this is an example of a leader's results on flexibility. So the leader took a psychometric assessment called the Distributed Leader Profiler, which is a great way of assessing a leader's strengths and gaps for managing remotely. So they took this, they spent 15 minutes doing this assessment. These are their results. So this particular leader, let's just call him John. John has some challenge here achieving his own work-life balance when he's working remotely, but he's pretty good at promoting it in his people. And then when it comes to versatile communication, he's in the middle here compared to other leaders. So this is a normative comparison. And then we can help John really look at the areas where he needs to improve and how. And we give John a lot of development advice in his report that he can pull from and really help John, whether it's through individual coaching, whether it's through training. We can help John with some of these very specific behaviors that he needs to be the best remote leader he can be. And this is one of the most prolific teams researchers from Harvard, Hackman, and he wrote a book called Leading Teams. And this was back in 2002. This was back in the early days when I was starting my research. And he said in this book that the structural conditions that foster effectiveness of face-to-face teams are just as critical for virtual teams, but with one caveat. It's much harder to create these conditions in virtual teams. It is much harder, but back in 2002, it was way harder than it is now. We did not have as good bandwidth. We did not have as good technologies for collaboration. Nowadays, we have beautiful technologies like Microsoft Teams, Slack, Zoom, GoTo, etc. And we are left with so many ways to communicate, which is great. And why I'm going to pass this on to April to share some of these habits with you.
Great, thanks, Laura. So for the next 15 or 20 minutes or so, I'm going to be focusing on various habits that you can develop in order to best support your teams when working remotely. As Laura mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to be focusing on a few different areas, primarily wellness, communication, and trust. As mentioned, we're just going to be scratching the surface of each of these different areas, but hoping that the information we're providing you with today will be practical immediately actionable, and applicable to you and your staff. So the first area I want to look into is improving wellness, and this is a term that we've started using when we talk about work and life, and we've replaced the term work-life balance, which, as Laura mentioned, implies an equilibrium or an equality between work and life that, in our opinion, just isn't attainable or even desirable for most people. So we prefer this term work-life wellness, where we're aspiring more to satisfaction and effectiveness in each domain, which ends up actually being a unique combination of time and energy for each person. So before we get into the topic of improving wellness, I'm just going to get Yusra to set up our second polling question for you here, which is to get a sense of what you struggle with most when it comes to work-life wellness. And a large fraction of you had mentioned that boundaries between work and life are a primary concern. So I'm curious which of these factors you feel like challenge you most, particularly when working remotely. Okay, and I'm actually able to see the responses here, Yusra, so I think I can hopefully do a bit of a summary here for everyone. Looks like actually half of you are feeling like taking time to actually move and get out and get fresh air is a challenge. I think especially because we are physically distancing right now, that's particularly challenging. Forgetting to take breaks looks like that's the second most common issue here, which is something we see quite often actually when working remotely, is that productivity can increase quite substantially because people tend to work continuously throughout the day. And then working long hours would be the third most common option there. And 11% of you saying that you're feeling better than ever. So that's great. I'd love to chat with you afterwards and figuring out what you're doing here, because you're obviously doing something right. We will get into a few of these in the next section here. And one of the big pieces I'd like to chat about first with you is this concept of boundary control. And when we think about improving our work-life wellness, the concept of boundary control is really, really key. And especially if you're in a position where you're a leader or a manager, setting an example for your staff in terms of boundary control can actually go a long way in terms of creating a standard. So first of all, good boundary control looks like communicating your working hours. So some of you are saying you're working long hours, maybe into the evenings and on the weekends, which isn't necessarily a bad thing when we are, like Laura mentioned, maybe schooling our kids from home at this point, and it might not be ideal for us to be working during work hours. So if your hours are irregular, the people you're working with need to be aware of this so they know when they can expect to hear from you. And to take this a step further, it can actually be really useful to ensure that the people you're working with actually know how to contact you, especially in cases of urgency. So, making it clear whether or not you're all right being contacted by text message for an urgent question, or if your preference would be email or phone. Defining your own preferences regarding work hours and response times will naturally work to give others permission to do the same and can really streamline communication. Another piece here around boundary control is that part of good work discipline is knowing when not to work, as much as knowing when to work. For those of you who are forgetting to take breaks and not taking time in your day to get up and get some fresh air and move around, being able to take breaks and communicating with people when you're unavailable will not only actually enhance your productivity, but will increase the efficiency of workflow and set a standard for your staff. So being able to have good boundaries and secondly, communicate those boundaries are really, really key for productivity and efficiency. And this sort of leads me into my next point here, which is to practice what you preach. So in dealing with COVID, we're all learning that physical health and mental health are top priorities and top of mind. If your staff observe you setting firm boundaries between work and non-work domains, they're more likely to follow suit themselves. So while we often think this needs to look like large-scale actions or grand gestures, small scale and subtle efforts day to day can actually go a really long way to creating healthy habits. And I'll give you a couple of examples of those now. So when we work remotely, we and our employees can feel pressure to work continuously. Part of the reason why many of you probably aren't taking breaks in your day. So being in uncertain times naturally contributes to a loss of structure in our lives, and helping to maintain some of that structure in our work will help to maintain wellness. So really simple tips to do this includes not scheduling meetings over lunch hours or at the ends of the day when they could go beyond work. Limiting your own email responding, we recommend 2 sessions per day, and making use of a delay send feature when you're emailing outside of work hours. All of these sorts of habits make it so people don't feel they need to constantly be on when they're working remotely. And this last one in particular can be tricky because, as I mentioned, it's often in the evenings when we have a moment away from kids or family that we can really get the mental and literal space that we need to catch up on work. But I encourage you all, if you're sending emails on a Saturday morning or a Sunday night, to use that delay send feature. It's naturally going to increase the stress of your staff before the work week has even begun if they're seeing emails starting to come through. So try using that feature and setting that boundary. The next section we're going to dig into a little bit here is how to improve trust when working remotely. And trust is a really interesting topic here. It's a lot more fragile among remote teams. And so if we look at the next slide here, we know that it's more difficult to establish trust when working remotely, and it's actually more easily broken when working remotely as well. So the thing we know is that remote work is actually an act of trust in itself. So it's necessary in order for a team to function. And that's not always the case in face-to-face teams. So as such, it's a foundational element to remote work success. And we see it as a prerequisite to positive outcomes related to things like effectiveness, productivity, and collaboration. And when we're thinking about trust as a concept, I want to pose our third polling question here to you, because I'm curious to hear from the group about what you feel to be the most important aspect of building trust when working remotely. You'll notice there isn't an all of the above option, and this isn't a trick question, but I am curious to know what you think. So what is the most important aspect of building trust when working remotely? All right, so just looking at the responses here, it looks like there's a couple of key themes. One large number of you have pointed out, 47%, saying that transparent communication is really important, and certainly it is. It's one of the sections of the presentation we'll get into today. And then the second highest rated answer was keeping and delivering on your promises, with 32% of people indicating that as the correct answer. And this is a tough question. I don't mean to suggest that these aren't all important. As you may have guessed, each of these are critical aspects of building trust, but the answer is actually C, so keeping and delivering on your promises. The reason being is that without consistency, there is nothing for trust to be built upon. And so if there's one thing you're going to take from this section, it's that consistency is really, really key as an element of trust. Now, I mentioned earlier that trust is more easily broken when working remotely. And on the next slide, we're going to see here just some of the ways that trust can be damaged. And these include things like being inconsistent with promises and deliverables, saying one thing but doing another, going silent or sending mixed messages, and either not acknowledging others' contributions or taking credit for their work yourself. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that we often don't realize we're damaging trust in these ways. We may actually think it's more efficient to just deal with things ourselves and save others the trouble. But what this really does is damages integrity and honesty by sending the message that we're keeping things from those we're working with. And so overt communication can actually go a really long way to building trust. And so if we're thinking about building trust, which we'll talk about in a moment, many of these can actually just be flipped on their head, and you'll get a recipe for establishing trust. Okay, and I just want to mention that I'm seeing some questions coming through, so we will address these at the end of the presentation and appreciate you asking these. The first thing that I want to speak to when we're talking about building trust and working apart is putting people first. This is probably the most important element of this factor. The first thing to consider, especially when you're working remotely, is to try to minimize distractions. It can be really easy when there's a screen between you and the person you're chatting with to check your emails, to multitask, to get sidetracked. I wouldn't be surprised if a couple of you have had a notification pop up on your screen since this started and been tempted to check in on that. So the reason this can be problematic is that it doesn't only cause us to lose focus, but it can also send the message that other people don't deserve our attention. And that in itself can naturally work to erode trust. The next point here when we're talking about putting people first is to take time to ask about someone's day and be willing to share your own personal experiences and challenges. So being sensitive and personally vulnerable about the impacts of work, uncertainties about COVID, personal lives, those sorts of things can really create space for what I like to call human connection. And you're not expected to know all the answers by any means, but you can still be a source of support. And what happens is when we create this space for connection with people, we're able to experience empathy. And with empathy, we can build relationships. At the end of the day, a strong personal connection is the quickest and most simple way to establish trust with someone. And we naturally do this more often in person, informally, during our conversations. So, we might stop by someone's office, we might go grab a coffee with them. There's always opportunities face-to-face for these personal connections. But when we are working remotely, it does need to be intentional in our virtual communications. So our office, our own meetings, we have a 5-minute personal moment at the beginning of most meetings where we can talk about something in our life that's not work related. I'd encourage you all to actually introduce this into your emails as well. We have a habit of jumping right into work when we send an email, getting right to the point. But try to introduce something to that dialogue that isn't work related and just see how valuable that can be to building that trust.
Brings me to the point, April. I think we have way too many meetings going on at the office, and it hasn't eased when we're working remotely. What I'm hearing from our clients is there's way too many meetings right now, and I think we run the risk of running from one to the other, and then we don't have a time to check in. We're always rushed to get down to task, and that is a real risk. We need to open up more white space in our calendars right now in order to put people first. That's my point.
Thanks, Laura. All right, so and next piece here around trust is around transparency and inclusivity. These are massively important, and again, often well-intentioned mistakes that we make here. So while you may be tempted to exclude people from conversations in an effort to not flood their inbox or worry with them with something that you don't deem to be important to their role, if we're giving mixed messages or saying different things to different people, that's when the potential for damaged trust really lives. When we work to keep others in the loop, we can prevent things like subgroups from forming or fault lines and questioning feelings from developing, which all have the potential to erode trust. Now, an important caveat here is that if you are really making an effort to keep others in the loop and make sure everyone's informed, we don't want to always rely or over-rely on one form of communication. So we'll get into that too, but something to pay attention to later in the presentation. The second piece here is that it's important to never assume someone has received something and understood a message as intended. So really, when we're working virtually, we have to take that extra step in our communication. Because what happens is, naturally, we do this in person, face-to-face. When we explain something to someone, we'll usually follow up with a question like, does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that? But we don't always take this step in virtual communication. So really being active about, first of all, ensuring your message has been received and providing feedback yourself when receiving the communication is critical. The final piece around trust here is to be proactive rather than reactive. And this is a message I really want to send home, and I do this in all of our presentations, but to create this overarching aspect of culture or environment of trust, it's actually not productive to make people earn your trust. And I know some of you had made comments about productivity earlier in the presentation. And the issue is that productivity doesn't always equal presenteeism, especially when we're working virtually. We can't actually see our teams. We can't actually see that people are working. So our recommendation is to give trust. It's much more empowering when it's in the hands of the people you're working with to continue to maintain and further build trust instead of feeling like they have to prove themselves. This will mean that others expect the same in return, and brings me back to that point of transparency. So always keeping your promises and deliverables as best you can. And when it's not possible, communicating delays, talking about changes, challenges, difficulties that you run into. Teams that operate with a high level of trust also tend to operate more efficiently. And that's in large part because they're being transparent about what's going well, but also what's not going well. All right, and then the third and final section here is improving communication. And this is often the most commonly cited struggle from people when we work with remote teams. So there's a couple of practices I'm going to share with you today. The first being to use regular check-ins. Now, checking in with your team will provide you with added structure, clarity, and guidance when you're working remotely, especially as we all adjust to these new work arrangements and we no longer have those informal water cooler conversations or the ability to step out of the office for a coffee. It's important to find other ways to connect to replace that face time. So the virtual coffee is the first one we recommend. This is really, really great for relationship building. And it means taking 20 minutes of your time to get on Zoom, GoToMeeting, or another video conferencing platform and just chat with a team member for 20 minutes. It's a great tool to facilitate better awareness and create opportunities for support and guidance, as your team might be unaware that they're struggling with an issue until they've vocalized it with you. So with the way our work is currently structured, and given that we have almost no face time with people anymore, we encourage these virtual coffees take place once a week. And then team huddles or drive-bys look a little bit different, but they serve as a great way to touch base, provide support, and to be accessible immediately to address any priorities and concerns that your team has. So these are usually brief 15-minute conversations with the larger group or team, and can be especially important in the early phases of a project or during high-intensity periods.
So we're in a high-intensity period right now. People are unsure, uncertain, overwhelmed, and potentially overloaded. And in the midst of this, there's layoffs happening in different places. And I think these team huddles are so important, even on a daily basis with your team. 15 minutes. How is everyone doing? Is there anything I can help you with as the leader? And are there priorities that you're juggling that we can help you choose what priority to focus on? You go around and it makes people feel so well supported. It's worth it, for sure.
Great, thanks, Laura. And then the final aspect around communication is versatility. In thinking about communicating when we're working apart from your team, being versatile and really becoming aware of the fact that in the most basic sense, not over-relying on any one communication method to engage with others is so important. The reality is that different types of communication mediums actually work better for certain types of people and for certain types of situations. And so it's important to make sure that you clarify and tailor the amount and type of communication to individual needs for those you're working with, just to know that one size does not fit all when it comes to communication preferences. So for example, me personally, I know that if something's project related, I really like to have an email chain about that. So there's a thread of that communication. But my team knows I'm not one to pick up the phone. So if they need to get a hold of me immediately or they have a question that needs answering, I've let my people know that I'm okay being contacted by text message. That's fine. That's a good way to get a hold of me. So making these clear with each other can really maximize the efficiency of your communication. And I'm just going to pass it back to Laura now, who's going to wrap up the presentation for today.
Thank you, April. Great points you made. And it's a good reminder for me as well sometimes. I mean, we're all learning here. So poll question number 4 is, what is one area that, sorry, one second. What is one area that you could improve your communication with your remote team. Could you do more of? Could you do more scheduling of regular huddles and drive-bys, like April just described beautifully? Could you rely less on email as a form of communication? And that was a slip I made, but it was actually a good one, because I think we reply all too much on email, and we reply to emails that are an FYI. And if we all reply a little less and avoid replying all too much, we can really decrease email communication and the clutter that's going on. The third is running more efficient virtual meetings. Could you do that as a leader? Or could you better utilize team software, Slack, MS Teams, etc., to keep in more regular real-time touch?
We have 17% said scheduling more regular huddles, 35% relying less on email as a form of communication, 30% running more efficient virtual meetings, and 17% said better utilizing team software to chat.
Excellent. So interesting dispersion, and a fair number of you folks said answers that fall in each of these categories. So I think we hit the mark in terms of things that you need to be doing more of and be more conscious and aware of, with the majority being relying less on email. And the biggest way to rely less on email is to make sure you're using a Slack, an MS Teams, or whatever other chat platform that you have that can capture conversations and really declutter inboxes. So that would be beautiful, which segues into that point D. Make sure that you're taking the time to learn the softwares. As a team, we implemented Microsoft Teams a number of months ago, and we're sure glad we did, because when COVID hit, it's been a beautiful tool for us. And even this morning, we were talking about using it better to schedule meetings through calendars and invite people to MS Teams meetings rather than Zoom and GoTo, which are our other platforms. So long story short is we all can continue to become better at these softwares. And as leaders, if we like it or not, we need to become better leaders of technology, of using different tools. So that's my point there. I'm just looking at the time. I'm just going to wrap up shortly here. I just wanted to tell you about distributed team effectiveness. And when you're working on a team, and a team is 2 or more people who rely on each other in some way, and they collaborate to get things done. And some organizations tell me, you know, we have a team of 35 people and we'd like to assess how well our team is doing as a remote team. And I say, you don't have a team of 30 people. You know, you probably have sub-teams within that 30 people, because a true team is relying on each other and communicating regularly. And they say, oh yeah, so the team, it's a broader group with 3 teams within it. You know, 1 team of 8, 1 of 12, and then the other of 10. And that tends to be the size of a team, you know, anywhere from 5 to 12 people on average. And this team effectiveness is about how well they're communicating, coordinating, and collaborating, how well they're trusting, committed, accountable, etc. when they are working remotely. Each team member answers 15 minutes of an online survey about their distributed team, and then results are aggregated. So nobody knows that Laura said this. What they know is that how is the team doing and what are our strengths and areas for action based on what we all said. So this team in particular, this is a team that I worked with, for example. So you'll see out of 5, you'll be able to see what the average was on these different areas. So trust is 3.61 out of 5. Is that something that we could work on as a team? Yes, it most definitely has room to improve. Let's talk about how. And oftentimes meeting management comes up as a big one, collaborating, having effective communication, not relying on email, though all those things will come up in this type of assessment. So if you want to try a demo of an assessment, it's free during the COVID-19 crisis. Not all of our tools, I mean, a team tool is more of a commitment because it's multiple people involved, but our leader assessment or our individual contributor remote personality fit for remote work is a great one to try. We'd be more than happy to let you try that as an organization, having a key person do it, and we'll walk you through the results. So this is my contact information, April's, our website, and our phone number. We actually still have a phone line. We love to hear voices, and we do get back to your calls right away. And that's our Canadian number for the folks that are outside of Canada right now. And we want to say we're sorry what everyone's going through in the crisis. We're sorry for our American friends. We're sorry for Eastern Canada that's been harder hit than us out here in the West. But I mean, all of us are hit in different ways, and our loved ones are hit. And I just want to say I'm really sorry, and that we're happy to do our part, and we're thinking about everyone from here at EvOHlution. So I'll pass it to Yusra to facilitate a Q&A for the last 13 or so minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hambley and Ms. Dyrda, for this extremely informative and useful webinar. On to the Q&A session. So the first question is, when trust is broken, do you address it with transparency right away?
Do you want to answer that, April, and then I can chime in?
Yeah,
or vice
certainly.
versa?
Yeah, no, I can take a stab at it. So I would say, certainly, yes, we want to make sure that any erosion of trust is addressed. Otherwise, it will kind of continue to fester. And the reality is that remote work is sort of a petri dish for trust issues, especially in the early stages of relationships. So I would say, yes, address it, but in a way that is appropriate. And one of the tips I'll have to give around this is to use what we would call rich communication mediums to have this conversation, which is anything that more closely resembles face-to-face. So if you are having sensitive conversations about broken trust, I would always recommend, if you can't meet face-to-face, to have a video call with that person, which allows you to see their body language, to see their expressions. It also allows for more synchronous communication, so that person can provide their input as well. So yes, address it as soon as possible, but make sure you're using the right medium to do that.
Yeah. Excellent. I fully agree with what April said. And I think our tendency, and in a lot of people actually, is to delay and delay, and then it festers like the petri dish. That's a great analogy. And then it gets worse, and then we let it build, and then we make up stories in our mind about the why behind it. We're really good as human beings at making up stories and hypotheses about why someone behaved in a certain way. And 9 times out of 10, that person did not intentionally want to cause harm. He did not intentionally want to be difficult, and they did not intentionally want to hurt us. And if they did, there's other problems to deal with. But yeah, as soon as possible before letting it fester, but with the right medium.
Thank you very much. Did you have anything to add? Sorry, did I interrupt you? No? Okay, perfect. On to the next question. Our audience member says, I agree that delivering on promises and commitments are important. So what can employees do when they realize, sometimes too late, that they won't get their commitments done?
I can answer that one. It's important to admit when you can't meet a deadline as soon as possible. And I think it's never too late. Like you've got to admit it, even if the deadline has passed yesterday, but it's better to admit it before and say, this deadline is end of day and I'm just not going to get it done, and here's why, and I need until when. And as a remote leader, the most important question you can ask is, how can I help? Like, is there something you need in order to get that done? Maybe they need more resources. Maybe they need more time. Maybe they need some mentorship. Maybe they need someone else on the team to help them. But how can I help you? And the person being transparent. And if people feel comfortable being transparent about deadlines and what they have on their plate, things go way more smoothly in remote work. Do you have anything to add to that, April?
I think you're right there, Laura. I'm just speaking to a culture of transparency, and it can take some time to establish and create that. But it's really key. And what Laura is speaking to here around asking how to support that individual, sometimes we make what I'd call an attribution error, which is that, this person isn't getting their work done because maybe they're worried that people are going to think they're lazy. But when we do open up that conversation about how can I support you, it becomes a learning conversation rather than one of blame.
And I think ego gets in the way of a lot. And one of my favorite books is called No Ego by Cy Wakeman, who's an American psychologist. And it's all about ego in the workplace and how it's one of the biggest barriers. And in remote work in particular, we need to get rid of our egos. We need to be transparent, open, vulnerable, and willing to say, how can I help you? Because we're all in this crisis together. We're all thrown into remote work situations and some are less than ideal. And we need to help each other out here.
Thank you. About vulnerability, so it is a big issue for some leaders. What would you recommend for them to do in order to overcome it?
April?
I think you almost just touched on it right now, Laura. One of the easiest ways to be vulnerable is to be curious. It's sort of a passive form of vulnerability, but showing people that maybe you don't know the answer or you're curious to learn more can be a great way to do that. When we're talking about vulnerability in terms of building personal connections, having conversations that aren't work-related are really the simplest way to do that, and creating those personal moments. They don't have to be overly private, but anything personal where you're connecting on a topic beyond work will show people that humanness, and that in itself is an act of vulnerability.
Yes, and I heard a leader speak yesterday of an energy company, and he was really good in terms of, he said, you know, one of our biggest focuses is the mental health of our people through all of this, because the mental health is definitely a huge challenge, and that we want to address it and be a place where our employees feel supported. And he talked about vulnerability, and he talked about being a cancer survivor, got cancer 2 years ago. He was really open, and he said, I'm transparent about that because, you know, I want to show people that it's okay. We're all humans. We're all going through different scenarios in our lives, and if the C-suite can be vulnerable and open, it trickles down and it makes for a much more transparent culture. So yes, taking a personal element to it. And some leaders have a struggle with that. They say work's work and home is home, and I don't want them to cross paths. Well, I have news for you. They have now, right? And it's better to be open and to say, you know what? I got 3 kids at home. My kids, age 9 to 14. I have a lot on my plate with that. Budgie birds, a husband at home, and we're trying to address all of that. A dog who might bark on the conference call, and we need to be honest about that. We need to bring in humor, and we need to show that we're human beings doing our best in less than ideal circumstances.
Thank you. About the bird, one of our audience members is very compassionate and says he hates that when that happens. So did you rescue the bird?
Absolutely, we rescued the birds. We did. Of course, we rescued the birds. Yeah, and the birds haven't been able to. Yeah, we're just not letting them out because their wings are full and they'll fly all over the place, and it's too stressful for them. And yeah, so long story short is, I think the birds, though, they add a beautiful element of nature, right? And I think the topic of nature is try to get outdoors every day, try to embrace nature as part of getting through this whole crisis.
Success, the bird has been rescued. Great, thank you. Our next question is, one of our audience members says, the leaders I coach say meetings and touch points with each person and their colleagues means they don't have time for their own work. Do you have any comments on that? And how can we help leaders realize the importance of doing so?
I'd love to answer this one, and then April, you can chime in, but I think I said it earlier, like, we need to be very careful about how many meetings we're scheduling, and we need to be careful of who needs to be involved in what's the agenda for the meeting, what are the outcomes of the meeting, what are the actions of the meeting. And if you can't produce an agenda and a rationale for who needs to be there and outcomes that will be actioned at the end of the meeting, then you're not ready to be having that meeting. So we have lots of tips that we share about meeting effectiveness and remote meeting effectiveness. And, you know, the gist is that we need more white space in our calendars. We need to be far fewer meetings so that we can focus on getting stuff done, getting our deliverables done. And if we're running from one meeting to another, we have no time to think, we're running late, we're not as personally focused, and we're not as efficient. What do you think, April?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big topic. Like Laura said, we have full sessions on purposeful communication and meeting management and those sorts of things. One thing about these touch points, though, is that if we are not having them, productivity and efficiency can plummet really quickly. And so in the long run, I'm going to say that it actually saves time to have these touch points.
I think touch points and huddles are different from the traditional meetings that I think we're having too much of, right? Like the traditional 1 hour meeting, right? With like multiple people involved and all that is different from the 15-minute huddle or the 20-minute virtual coffee. So I think it's like April said, focus more on the huddles and the drive-bys and the one-on-ones, and maybe a few less of the big bulky meetings that fill up all your day would be what I'd say. And Yusra, I want to see what other questions we have. I know we only have 2 minutes.
Of course. 2 last questions. So how do you recommend leaders play a role in supporting self-care during this time? And how do you recommend they open up the dialogue on their teams?
Why don't you answer that one, and then I'll answer the last one, April.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, one of the most important things to be conscious of here and to take a bit of pressure off yourself is to not expect to know the answers. You can still have conversations with people about self-care, their mental health, and these sorts of things without feeling like you need to be an expert. Rather, you're just there as a support, and you're often a first point of contact for people. With that said, I would say make yourself knowledgeable about the resources that are available to people if their self-care is hurting, if their mental health is hurting. And then second of all, to set that standard, to practice what you preach. Your staff are going to follow your lead, and actions speak louder than words. So if you're prioritizing your own self-care and your own mental health, they're likely going to see that as a model.
Great.
Thank you. And our last question is, so for people who are not comfortable with using their webcam, what do you suggest for team members who don't like to share their webcams on meetings?
I mean, what would you say to someone who said, I'm not comfortable coming into the meeting room at the office. I want to stay in my office and just phone in. What would the leader say there? They'd say, no, you need to come into the meeting room, right? You may not want people to see you, but it's part of our culture. It's part of our humanity. So I really feel strongly about video is important. It keeps people engaged. It makes people dress the part more, which psychologically helps get them into the work frame of mind. It personalizes the connection, and it keeps them focused and not multitasking. So I mean, video to me is a requirement, unless there's something I'm not knowing, some other extraneous reason. I feel video should be a requirement.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
But yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hambley and Ms. Dyrda, for this excellent webinar and for describing some of the challenges and opportunities presented by remote work during the COVID-19 crisis, and for teaching us about key behaviors and strategies to maintain trust and communication when leading from a distance. Thank you for helping us promote work wellness. And to our audience, thank you. And to our audience, thank you all for your continued support and your interest in our webinars. Immediately following the webinar, you will be directed to the evaluation survey. We greatly appreciate your input on our webinars as well as suggestions for future topic areas. If you would like to get a certificate of attendance for this session, Please email your request to projectadmin@www.dpi.org. Members of the Work Wellness Institute receive free certificates. If you're not a WWI member, the administration fee is $15. I would like to remind that the Work Wellness Institute is recognized by Society for Human Resource Management, SHRM, to offer professional development credits, PDCs, and the webinar is also valid for credits for VRA Canada. Our next Effective Workplaces and Harnessing Talent Alliance webinar is Returning and Thriving at Work After Sickness Absence. The webinar will be presented by Dr. Karina Nielsen, Chair of Work Psychology and Director of the Institute of Work Psychology at the University of Sheffield in the UK. All of our webinars are created for public access and supported by voluntary donations and memberships. Thank you again for your participation, and thank you to our presenters.
Thanks for having us.